night of March 18th, 1919, the entire city of New Orleans did something no American city has ever done before or since. Every dance hall filled to capacity. Every parlor, every porch, every open window spilled the sound of trumpets and clarinets and voices out into the dark. Amateur musicians who hadn't touched an instrument in years dug them out of closets. Families who couldn't play a single note gathered around, borrowed phonographs, and turned the volume as high as it would go. Streetcars rattled past houses lit up like celebrations, every window glowing, every door propped open just enough to let the sound spill out onto the sidewalk. By midnight, the entire city was, by every account, the loudest it had ever been, and they were doing it because a serial killer had personally requested it. In a letter published days earlier in the city's largest newspaper, and nobody in New Orleans was willing to find out what happened if they didn't comply. This is the story of the Axeman of New Orleans, a killer who broke into homes at night, murdered people in their beds with weapons he found on their own property, wrote directly to the newspaper claiming to be a demon from hell, and then simply vanished, never identified, never caught. His final act possibly ending not in a courtroom, but in a completely different American city, at the hands of someone with a very personal reason to find him. Stay with me, because this case has one of the strangest endings of anything I've covered on this channel, and I promise you will not see it coming. New Orleans in 1918 was a city already exhausted. The First World War was grinding toward its final months, pulling young men out of every neighborhood and leaving families stretched thin. A flu pandemic was beginning to spread through crowded neighborhoods, filling hospitals and cemeteries alike. Small immigrant-run grocery stores, the kind of family businesses that dotted nearly every block of the city's working-class neighborhoods, stayed open long hours to survive, often leaving their owners exhausted, isolated, and asleep the moment the front shutters finally came down for the night. And into that atmosphere, starting in May of that year, a pattern of break-ins began that, individually, might have looked like isolated tragedies, but together, formed something the city had never faced before. The killer's method rarely changed. He targeted small grocery stores, many of them run by Italian immigrant families who lived in rooms attached to or above their own shops. Exhausting work that often meant falling asleep the moment the store closed for the night. He would chisel a panel out of a back door, quietly let himself inside, and locate an axe or a hatchet already on the premises, usually kept near the woodpile or the kitchen. He rarely brought his own weapon. He simply used whatever his victims already owned, then left it behind, often propped almost deliberately near the scene, before disappearing into the dark without taking money, jewelry, or anything of obvious value. Joseph Maggio and his wife Catherine were among the first widely reported victims, attacked in their bed in the rooms behind their grocery in May of 1918. Neighbors reportedly heard nothing until the following morning, when Maggio's own brothers, arriving to open the store, discovered the scene themselves. Investigators at the time noted the eerie, deliberate quality of the crime scene, a chiseled door panel, a bloodied axe left behind, and almost nothing else to go on. Over the following months, similar attacks followed at other small grocery stores across the city, each one carrying the same unmistakable signature, and each one leaving behind almost no physical evidence beyond the weapon itself. Detectives compared notes between precincts, but in an era before centralized case files or any real forensic science to speak of. Connecting one grocery store attack to another largely depended on which officers happened to remember which previous case, and how thoroughly anyone had bothered writing it down. In August of that year, two teenage girls, Pauline and Mary Bruno woke to sounds coming from their elderly uncle's bedroom. What they found was Joseph Romano, struck violently enough that the injury reached his brain. He would die of his wounds 2 days later. The girls did catch a glimpse of the attacker fleeing into the night, dark-skinned, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit and hat, one of the only physical descriptions to ever come out of the entire case, and one investigators were never able to turn into an actual identification. By the end of 1918, New Orleans newspapers had given the attacker a name that would stick for the rest of history: the Axeman. Fear spread through the city's Italian immigrant community especially hard, since almost every confirmed victim ran a small grocery business, and rumors began circulating that Sicilian organized crime networks, feuds within immigrant communities, or even a supernatural force were somehow behind the killings. The New Orleans Police Department, already thin, already stretched by wartime staffing shortages, struggled to connect the individual attacks into anything resembling a coherent investigation, made worse by the death, a year earlier, of the police superintendent who had originally been tracking an even earlier string of similar break-ins some believed stretched back years before the Axeman name was ever coined. Then, in March of 1919, the case took the turn that would make it famous forever, and it started with a letter, one that would end up more widely quoted, more widely mocked, and more widely feared than almost anything else in the history of American true crime. On March 13th, a letter arrived at the offices of the Times-Picayune, New Orleans' largest newspaper, addressed simply to the people of the city. It was signed dramatically "From Hell," and it opened with words that read less like a criminal's confession and more like a theatrical performance. "They have never caught me, and they never will," the letter announced. "They have never seen me, for I am invisible, even as the ether that surrounds your earth. I am not a human being, but a spirit and a demon from the hottest hell." The letter went on, boasting that the writer left no real clue behind except his bloody axe, taunting the police directly for what he called their utterly stupid investigation, and then arriving at its strange, now famous demand. At exactly 12:15 in the morning on the night of March 19th, the writer claimed he would pass over New Orleans, and he promised, in his own words, that he was very fond of jazz music and would spare every single person in whose home a jazz band was playing at that exact moment. Anyone who didn't, the letter warned, might not be so lucky. The newspaper published it in full, and New Orleans, whether out of genuine terror, morbid curiosity, or simply because a city-wide party sounded like a good idea regardless of the reason, took the letter's demand completely seriously. That night, dance halls sold out entirely. Private homes across every neighborhood filled with live musicians, borrowed instruments, and hastily rehearsed jazz standards played at full volume until well past midnight. Restaurants that normally closed by 10 stayed packed and loud past 2 in the morning. Streetcar conductors reportedly said they could hear music from blocks away in almost every direction they traveled that night. An entire city turning itself, however briefly, into one continuous performance for an audience of one invisible, self-declared demon. A local musician named Joseph John Davila reportedly finished writing an entire novelty song titled The Axeman's Jazz in the early hours of that same night, rushing it to print to capitalize on the citywide panic-turned-celebration. The song's sheet music cover showed a terrified family playing music while nervously watching their front door. And that night, exactly as the letter had promised, nobody in New Orleans was attacked at all. Whether that was genuine mercy from a killer keeping his word, pure coincidence, or something else entirely, is a question this case has never fully answered. Because here's the detail that should trouble you. Investigators were never able to confirm the letter actually came from the killer himself. No handwriting match, no detail inside it that definitively proved insider knowledge only the Axeman could have had. It's entirely possible, some historians argue, that the letter was a hoax, written by someone else entirely, perhaps even a bored newspaperman, or, as some researchers have pointed out with real suspicion, perhaps even Davila himself, a musician who happened to have a brand new jazz record ready to sell the very same week an entire city suddenly needed one. For several months afterward, the attacks seemed to pause, and New Orleans allowed itself, cautiously, to believe the worst might genuinely be over. It wasn't. On August 10, 1919, grocer Steve Boca was attacked in his home in the same familiar pattern, surviving his injuries but unable to offer investigators anything more than the same frustratingly vague description that had followed the case from the beginning. A second, less severe attack followed not long after. And then, on October 27, 1919, the Axeman claimed what would become his final confirmed victim. Mike Pepitone, another Italian grocer, was beaten to death in his bed with a level of violence witnesses later described as far more brutal than the earlier attacks. His wife, Esther, was in an adjoining room with the couple's children at the time, and later told investigators she caught only a brief glimpse of a large figure fleeing into the darkness before she could fully process what had happened, rushing past her in the dark hallway before vanishing out the same chiseled door panel that had become the killer's signature entrance for a year and a half. It was, on the surface, simply the latest entry in a pattern that had haunted the city for nearly a year and a half. Nobody in New Orleans could have predicted what Esther Pepitone would do next, or how long it would take her to do it, or how far she would eventually travel to do it. The attack stopped completely after Mike Pepitone's murder. No further killings were ever officially attributed to the Axeman. The case, never solved, slowly faded from urgent front-page news into unsolved local legend, the same way so many cases on this channel eventually do. Filed away, revisited occasionally, never closed. Then, in December of 1920, more than a year later, in a city over 1,800 miles away, the story took its final, almost unbelievable turn. Esther Pepitone, Mike's widow, shot and killed a man named Joseph Mumfre on a street in Los Angeles, California. When police arrested her, she gave them an extraordinary explanation. She claimed Mumfre was the Axeman, that she had spent more than a year tracking him across the country, and that she had finally found and killed the man responsible for murdering her husband. Some researchers have since connected Mumfre to New Orleans criminal networks active during the exact years of the killings, and noted that reports of axe-style attacks in New Orleans had indeed stopped entirely after his death, a detail true crime writers have leaned on for over a century since. But Esther Pepitone's claims were never independently verified by police in either city. No formal charge was ever filed connecting Mumfre to a single one of the Axeman's murders, and Esther herself was ultimately convicted of manslaughter for the shooting, serving time in prison for taking the law and her theory of who the Axeman really was, entirely into her own hands. So the case ends, officially, exactly where it started. Unsolved, no confirmed identity, no trial, just a widow's conviction, in every sense of that word, that she had found and ended the man responsible, and a police record that was never able to either prove or fully dismiss her. What's left, over a century later, is a case built almost entirely on absence. No confirmed motive was ever established for why an unidentified man would murder Italian grocers specifically, across more than a year, using their own tools against them. No reliable physical description ever existed beyond a single hurried glimpse from two frightened teenagers. Even the letter that made this case famous worldwide, the single piece of writing most people associate instantly with the Axeman, cannot be confidently attributed to the killer at all. What remains certain is this: for one specific night in March of 1919, an entire American city took a serial killer's word seriously enough to fill its streets with music instead of silence. And whether that decision saved lives or simply coincided with a quiet night that would have happened anyway, nobody has ever been able to say for certain, and nobody ever will. A century later, the letter is remembered fondly, almost affectionately, printed on souvenir postcards and quoted in jazz history books. The horror of it softened by time into something closer to local folklore than the record of an actual killer who took at least half a dozen lives. It's worth remembering, underneath the novelty song and the citywide party it inspired, that real people bled and died in their own beds while their neighbors, just streets away, played music for their lives without ever fully knowing why. If this case pulled you in the way it pulled me in, tell me in the comments who you think the Axeman really was. Joseph Mumfree, exactly as Esther Pepitone believed. Someone else entirely. Or someone we'll simply never know. And if you want more real unsolved mysteries told exactly like this one, subscribe to Crime Through Time, because this channel exists for cases exactly like this one.